Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, we continue our series, Hollywood 1928. And our film is The Cameraman by Buster Keaton. And it's his last masterpiece, and a masterpiece shot in part in New York City. It has all the characteristics of this greatest of American artists in oh so many ways. We'll be talking about that and much more about the context of the filmmaking after today's screening. Joining us once again on City Cinematheque will be Imogen Smith, author of Buster Keaton, The Persistence of Comedy. Now, enjoy a tour of New York City in 1928 with Buster Keaton in The Cameraman. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed this trip to New York City in 1928, guided by the cameraman, Buster Keaton. It's a great film. It's a film very rich in any number of ways, both on its own terms and also in the context in which it was made. We've got some time to talk about that, and it's a pleasure to welcome back to City Cinematheque, Imogen Smith. Imogen is the author of Buster Keaton, Persistence of Comedy, among many other writings. And those other writings also include a very specific essay done for the Criterion Collection on The Cameraman. So it's a film you've thought about more than just a little bit. Imogen, welcome back.
Thank you, Jerry. Yes, I have thought about this film more than a little bit. It's a film I love, so I'm very happy to be here talking about it with you.
Good. Well, also, you know, one of the great things about your book is that you survey his entire career, and you integrate the threads of his own life with the threads of production history, as well as institutional history, who he was working for or not, why, etc. So let's just enter through the portal of 1928, and who's Keaton in 1928 in terms of his trajectory?
Well, it's very interesting because Buster Keaton, who was born in 1898, so born the same year as the movies, and in 1928, he is at the peak of his game artistically, professionally. He's a big star. He's had an amazing decade. He is also about to go through a terrible professional and personal downfall.
Okay.
And 1928 is also the last full year of silent film. There will continue to be some made in 1929, but everybody already knows sound film is coming in. And in 1928, we see silent film at its absolute zenith.
Correct.
Incredibly sophisticated, creative, fluent, and we know it's about to end. And so in a sense, Keaton again is kind of in the same place as this art form that he is involved in. So the reason for all of this is because in 1928, Joseph Schenck, who had been his independent producer, he had financed Keaton's own studio. So starting in 1920, Keaton has his own studio. He has his own dedicated team. He has a cameraman. He has a art director. He has gag writers. And he's able to make films with tremendous freedom. I mean, it's really a filmmaker's dream. And this is the way he has made all of his short films and his features up to this point. But in 1928, Schenck tells him, I'm going to close the studio. I'm going to sell your contract to MGM.
Okay.
MGM, where Schenck's brother, Nicholas Schenck, was a producer. And so he kind of sells it to Keaton as it's all in the family and you're just going to go be at MGM. And Buster Keaton knew that this was not what he wanted. He knew that he was not going to be able to work with the same freedom at a big studio like MGM. He later, in his memoir, called this the biggest mistake of my life, going to MGM. But he didn't really have any choice. I mean, he was not in a position personally to be able to produce, finance his own films. He was not able to find another person who wanted to do for him what Schenck had done. So he goes to MGM. The Cameraman was his first film at MGM. It's also his second to last silent film. But although his time at MGM ultimately would be, I have to say, pretty disastrous.
Okay, yes.
Artistically, you know, and this combines with sort of personal problems that he had. But the cameraman, he fights really, really hard for this movie and to make it his way. And this one time, he actually won some of those battles.
Okay.
You know, he went to Irving Thalberg. They had presented him with a finished script. And Keaton had never worked with a complete screenplay before. You know, there was no need. He said we would have we would figure out the beginning, we would figure out the ending, and we figured the middle would take care of itself. Because he liked to be able to improvise. Sometimes something might go wrong, but this would give him an idea for how to do something different. So he liked to have freedom, and he liked to have a very simple story. He would always say, you know, give the comedian room to move around. You know, we don't need a lot of plot. And so they gave him this script for the cameraman, and he said it was full of subplots and extraneous characters, and they had had 23 different writers working on it, and you know, it was too much. And so he got Thalberg's permission this one time to basically throw out this script, you know, work in his own way. And several of the best, funniest scenes in The Cameraman were actually improvised or were things that he came up with during the shooting that were not in the original script. This includes the changing room scene.
Absolutely, a classic.
A classic, for which he actually just recruited Ed Brophy, who was a unit manager, he was not an actor, to do this scene because he had gotten this inspiration. They did it in one take. The great scene in Yankee Stadium where he pantomimes a baseball game was something he came up with because he was there in New York City. So he's able to work in this way that, you know, stimulated his imagination and gave him that kind of freedom. And he would never really have that freedom again.
So one of the things that's very interesting about that, because I've had the great pleasure through the years of teaching any number of these films made in this remarkable decade of creativity, is that his balance between invention, that is finding something he wants to do, and where that fits into the overall structure of what he does, that moving around in a simple plot, they end up being some of the most tightly designed comic structures ever created in cinema. So he knew how to take invention and then put it in a place that it functioned so beautifully. And I would say that the Yankee Stadium thing, yes, you get to see his remarkable skills physically with the looking, and you visualize the entire thing through his bodily movements and his great camera placement, as well. But it fits perfectly in the story as it's fully now, constructed. That, I'm sure, is what panicked the studio. I mean, among other things, is that how can you do something that isn't planned and then becomes a perfect part of the plan?
I completely agree. And I think part of the reason that he was able to do that is that what you see in all of his great films is that he would hit on one premise and often a particular prop that everything could then be built around. I mean, you see this in his very first independent film, 1 Week, where it is entirely structured around the building of a house.
Right.
You see in The Navigator, it's all about this ocean liner. In The General, the locomotive and the idea of the locomotive chase. And so he has this one structure, he has a simple goal, and he has some kind of prop or setting that is going to give him a lot of ideas.
Right.
And so, it inspires these, improvisations, but it's got this structure. And in The Cameraman, it is, of course, the camera.
Yes.
This is Buster Keaton's love letter to the camera. And the scene where he comes into the office the first time, he's followed Marceline Day, this beautiful young woman he's just met. But he sees this camera and he starts kind of, looking at it, trying the gears, and And this, I think, is almost a recreation of what happened to Keaton himself the very first day in 1917 that he went to a movie studio. He had never been in a movie studio. He came out of a vaudeville background, but he had met Roscoe Arbuckle, who invited him to come to his studio. And he said, the first thing I was interested in was the camera. And the first thing I wanted to do was I wanted to take the camera to pieces. I had to know how it really worked. I wanted to understand how the film goes through the camera, how it's cut, how it goes through the projector. He had this mechanical mind, and so he loved the camera, and the camera loved him.
Absolutely.
And so in this film, we see him, it says in the film, this is his tribute to Cameraman, but he really was himself one of these people who had this kind of innate relationship to the camera. And because he has this simple premise where it is him trying to make good as a cameraman, everything then kind of falls into place around that.
Yeah, and this brings up this whole question of authorship and Keaton, because when he had his own studio, frequently, he's credited with directing, but somebody else is crediting with directing. But what we get from the testimony of all those around him was, this is just such a nice thing to be able to say about somebody. It was fun working with Buster Keaton. There was a real sense of spirit when he had his studio. They were successful, so they were continuing. They could fund themselves. So in a certain sense, the narcissistic question of authorship never came up, because it was all Buster's team in a kind of way. But he was the organizing intelligence.
That's absolutely true. And the tragedy of MGM really was that to the studio, right, he was a performer. Wow. They did not want to see him as a filmmaker. And part of it was that he had been kind of modest about it. And he liked to sort of make fun of people who were credit hogs. And so he right, probably could have said, written by Buster Keaton, directed by Buster Keaton. He didn't want to do that, but it meant that he wasn't really recognized for the fact that by all accounts, of the people who worked with him, exactly, he was primarily directing everything. He liked to have an assistant because, of course, he's also in the scenes. But he was the presiding creative intelligence. And the cameraman is really kind of the last time we see him getting to work in that way, even though it does have another credited director, Edward Sedgwick, who, after a slightly bumpy start, he recognized that Keaton knew what he was doing, right, and that, the thing to do was just kind of like give him a long rope and let him, do things on his own.
Well, one of the things that's so delightful about Keaton in each of one of these, tropes he takes that organizes each of them is that he goes in different directions, and so he is a reflexive filmmaker. I mean, he would shy off, he had no interest in theoretical talk or that. He was a practical storyteller in his medium. But of course, there's the earlier film, which is very self-reflexive about filmmaking, Sherlock Jr. But it's, please correct me if I'm not quoting you correctly. I think you talk about that is a film that's about film as fantasy, because it is a projectionist who falls asleep, and then there's all these adventures of Sherlock Holmes' character, and it is a wonderful, wonderful film. This, coming back, The Cameraman is about how the camera can really tell the truth, right?
Yes, absolutely. And a couple of things I want to say about that. First of all, I mean, he does have fun playing with this sort of inadvertently avant-garde effects of the mistakes that he makes as a neophyte cameraman. And we should explain maybe, viewers might have noticed that there's a point right at that part of the story when he first goes out and he's trying to, film everything. The film gets a little choppy. This is actually because the film is incomplete. There are a couple of scenes missing. The story is that the film was so successful, MGM really saw it as a kind of perfectly constructed comedy, and they would show it to new comedians as an example, as a kind of training film. And it was played so many times, it had so many prints struck from the negative that they lost some bits. And so the parts that are missing are some of the scenes where he tries to shoot the launching of an ocean liner, he tries to shoot an admiral, and he's actually filming a hotel doorman. These are things in New York City that he shot. But he does have fun with the kind of the double exposures, and some of that is in there. But the other thing about what you said is, the thing I love about this film is it ultimately is about how he is vindicated by the film, after he thinks, that his rival has succeeded in, stealing the credit for his rescue. He's totally dejected. And then it's the film that, both shows his skill and his bravery, and, the fact that he had gone out and saved Marceline from drowning. And so in the same way that, even though at this moment in his life he's kind of about to go into this dark period, his films, in surviving in that same way, are his vindication.
Well, no, it's a superb point about the fact that, for those who do not know, he went through these difficulties, and then he had a presence as an artist later in his career. I mean, he was successful in Europe. He would show up in interesting places. People can watch Richard Lester's delightful A Funny Thing Happened on the way to the Forum, and he has a very late career role there, which is very much an homage to himself. He has the pork pie hat, as I think I remember in it. But it has been, and we'll give a little bit of credit to our profession, here, that people have said, no, this is really one of the great American artists of the 20th century who was a true filmmaker, who brought comedy, through his invention to a kind of new form in cinema that, I'm not surprised by this story of MGM, because when I teach Keaton to filmmaking students, one of the first things I say is, this is the person, you can't imitate being Buster Keaton, but you can imitate how carefully he constructs everything, because everything is in place. No matter how much he shot during production, no matter how much he improvised doing it, his sense of, proportion and structure is so nuanced. And that, if you want a tightly constructed story, he's the person who can teach you how to do that.
Absolutely. And yes, so he did live to see himself celebrated.
Right.
He did live to see himself recognized, which is really important. But yes, he, came out of this background of slapstick comedy.
Right.
Early silent comedy. Traditionally, there was very little concern for plot or structure or credibility. It was just, wild and crazy and often surreal and chaotic. And when he started to make, really, even from his short films, you see this much greater concern for structure. But particularly when he started to make feature films, he said, I knew there had to be a story, and that the story was the most important thing, and audiences had to care about the character. And that anything that was extraneous to the story, we would throw it out. And he said, there was anything he hated, it was the idea of, dragging a gag in by the heels, as he said. You can't do something just because, maybe it would be funny if I did that. It has to serve the story. It has to be credible for the character. And so when you see The Cameraman, it is very, very funny, and there are some really funny scenes, but it also is, it works as a romantic comedy. It works as a story, as all of his films are really a story about a man coming into his own. A man who starts out seeming incompetent, seeming very sort of meek, and by the end he has proved himself, and he has been sort of transformed by love, and by love not only for the girl, but love for the work that he's doing.
Absolutely.
I think that is sort of the arc of all of his films. And yeah, the story was paramount to him. And I think in The Cameraman you see the kind of him pushing it almost as far as it can go to
Right.
being sort of dramatic. And, he's never sentimental, but it's sort of as far as he goes in really bringing a lot of emotion into a film is this.
Right. So let's talk about one of the great actors in the film besides Buster Keaton.
Josephine.
Josephine the monkey. So how does that work in the film, as it were?
Keaton loved animals.
Okay.
Animals loved Keaton. He has animals in a lot of his films, including in Go West, his leading lady is a cow. So it was not a completely new thing.
Right.
Josephine, who I believe had actually, we could say, started her career as an organ grinder's monkey.
Right.
And she also appears in Harold Lloyd's film, I think it's Grandma's Boy.
I think that's right,
in.
but we'll both say that, okay. and we'll let the audience check.
Yes, but I mean, if there were an Oscar for animal performance, Josephine would be a shoo-in. I mean, she is amazing in the way she actually exhibits, all these different emotions. But what is so touching is the rapport that you can see between her and Buster, and indeed they became good friends. There are pictures of him on the set where she's sitting on his shoulder. They're sharing snacks, and it's a lovely relationship.
Well, and also it's also, if I may say so, so Keaton-esque because she just fits in. That is, we don't. In the story world that he has created, she's just another character in that story world. And this just goes back to what you were saying. We may, after we finish the film, think, wait a minute, there's just this, I think there's the greatest monkey performance I've ever seen, okay? But while you're watching the story unfolding, you're not aware of it as such in that way. That is, it is, she enters into the story, she performs beautifully as part of that story world. And of course, as directed by Buster Keaton, because when the camera pulls back and we see that she's cranking it, we know, okay, maybe this is going to show up in a very good way. And of course, it becomes the crux of the reversal and the fact that she's, what we think is an error of her switching out canisters or whatever, or reels, is actually the engine of writing all the things in the plot.
Yes, I mean, I think that it is also true to say that some of this quality that you're talking about of how he's able to work with great freedom and yet everything seems to fit together so smoothly is something that's possible in silent film in a way that, sound film becomes a very different medium. And by the way, I should say, for a long time there was kind of an idea that Buster Keaton, his career declined because he couldn't make the transition to sound. I don't think that was the primary problem. I think the problem was that he didn't have, the freedom, the artistic autonomy anymore. He was actually extremely interested in sound. I mean, he was always excited by technology. He had ideas about how he wanted to use sound, which he didn't really get to.
Which were not the same ideas as the studio had.
Not the same ideas as the studio, which was, just sort of layer on lots and lots of loud, corny dialogue, But I think in this film you can see some of the ways in which silence, it allows him to play with time. I mean, for instance, the wonderful scene where he gets the phone call from Sally.
Oh, thank you.
And this is the great scene filmed in New York, where he runs up Fifth Avenue. It was filmed very early on a Sunday morning to avoid crowds. But, he drops the phone, he sprints, 20 or 30 blocks, and he manages to arrive while she is still on the phone. And it's like, obviously, we're not in the realm of strict
chronological time,
chronological verisimilitude here, and yet it's plausible because he sort of sets the pace of the film.
Okay.
And that's something you can do in silence in a way where sound, I feel, creates a kind of realism and a stricter kind of film time.
Well, I'll just put it, I'm fully agreeing with you, put it just a slightly different way. It allows him to create and actually a kind of original physics of the story world he creates, in which he can warp or change time, but it's that warping is subordinate to the story, and it always, therefore, we buy it, and we not only buy it, but we delight in it, which is all part of watching a Buster Keaton film.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, we're going to actually, I think it's a good place for us, since we've run out of time. So, I'll say it's a good place for us to stop, but I think delight and Keaton are two words that should always be, put together. So, thank you, and thank you for joining us here today on City Cinematheque. If you'd like to know more about City Cinematheque, please look for us on the website of CUNY TV. That's www.tv.cuny.edu. And I've got some other good news for you. CUNY TV now has its own app. You can find that app at the app stores, but you can also find it on our website. So please download the CUNY TV app and make it part of your life on your tablet and on your phone. You can stream our programming anywhere on that app. Once again, www.tv.cuny.edu. Imogen, it's always a pleasure to have you here, bringing your immense knowledge of Buster Keaton, but of so many other aspects of American and global film culture. Thanks again for what you've given us today, and I look forward to the next chat we'll be able to have.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, and thank you for joining us here on City Cinematheque. And please, in coming weeks, or from YouTube, or from the app, join us on other episodes of City Cinematheque as we continue our stroll through the archives of film history. For now, it's goodbye.